Hi, everyone. I don't really know how to start this, but here goes. My name's Eric, and I'm about to share something that I honestly never thought I'd experience. If you've ever felt that gut-wrenching moment where your world starts to tilt, you'll get this. It's about betrayal, revenge, and the lengths someone will go to when they're hurt. I've been married to Sarah for almost 7 years. We met in college and hit it off instantly. You know that feeling when you just know you found your person? That was us. We laughed at the same stupid jokes, supported each other through tough times, and built a life together. Everything seemed perfect, or at least I thought it was. A couple of months ago, I noticed Sarah acting differently. Nothing huge at first, just little things that made me pause. She was suddenly more glued to her phone than ever before, giggling at texts she wouldn't share, and started dressing up more often, just for herself. I thought, hey, good for her, but part of me was uneasy. Then there were the nights she worked late more frequently and the weekends when she'd disappear for hours to clear her head. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Then came the business trip that changed everything. My job sent me to Seattle for 3 days, but I wrapped things up early and decided to surprise Sarah by coming home a day ahead of schedule. I even stopped by her favorite bakery to grab her favorite cake, imagining how happy she'd be. Walking into our house that night, everything felt off. You know that weird stillness when something just isn't right? The house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah wasn't expecting me home yet, and at first, I thought she was asleep. But when I walked upstairs, I noticed her phone on the nightstand. Normally, she'd never leave it behind, which struck me as strange. I didn't look at it right away. I wanted to trust her. I really did. But curiosity, and maybe some underlying dread, got the better of me. I unlocked the phone, we knew each other's passcodes, and opened her texts. That's when the floor fell out from under me. There were messages from someone named Blake. At first, they looked innocent, old friends catching up, I thought, but then I scrolled further. I won't repeat everything I saw, but let's just say there was no mistaking what was going on. It was explicit. Photos. Plans. Even a message from that day saying, "Can't wait to see you tonight once Eric's gone," winky face. I couldn't breathe. My hands started shaking, and my vision blurred. That moment, right there, is when my life as I knew it cracked in two. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like the air had been punched out of my lungs. My mind was racing. Should I wait and gather more evidence? Should I confront her right then and there? Should I pretend I didn't see anything? But deep down, I knew there was no going back from this. I heard the front door open, and Sarah walked in, carrying a shopping bag. She was humming, completely oblivious. I couldn't move at first. My heart was pounding in my chest, but then something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to play dumb and let her lie to my face. "Hey," I called out from the kitchen, my voice sharper than I intended. She froze mid-step when she saw me. "You're home early," she said, her face lighting up. But that smile quickly faded when she noticed the tension in my expression. "Is something wrong?" I didn't even bother easing into it. "Who's Blake?" Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of panic in her eyes. She tried to recover, laughing nervously. "Blake? He's just an old friend." "Why? An old friend you're sending half-naked pictures to?" I shot back, holding up her phone. Her face went pale. "You went through my phone," she stammered, as if that was the biggest betrayal here. "Eric, that's such an invasion of privacy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's what you're focusing on? Not the fact that you've been sneaking around with someone else behind my back?" She started talking fast, tripping over her words. "It's not what it looks like. I mean, yeah, Blake and I were talking, but it's not serious. It's just a stupid mistake. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. You plan to meet him tonight, Sarah. While I was supposed to be out of town. How long has this been going on? She looked down at the floor, avoiding my gaze. A few months, she admitted quietly, and that was like a knife to the chest. But I swear, it's not what you think. I love you, Eric. I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to believe her. God, a part of me wanted so badly for her to say something, anything, that would make this all go away. But the evidence was there, staring me in the face, and her excuses just felt hollow. You didn't mean to hurt me. I said, my voice shaking with anger. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And you were planning to keep doing it. Do you even feel guilty, or are you just upset you got caught? Her eyes filled with tears, and she started apologizing, over and over. But none of it felt real to me. I couldn't tell if she was genuinely sorry or just panicking because her secret was out. All I knew was that the woman I thought I knew, the one I trusted with everything, had just shattered our life together like it was nothing. After Sarah's half-hearted apologies and attempts to explain herself, I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her. I grabbed my keys and walked out, ignoring her calling after me. I didn't even know where I was going, I just needed air, space, anything to stop the flood of emotions from consuming me. I parked my car at a nearby empty lot and just sat there, staring out into the darkness. The anger came first, hot and sharp, making my chest feel like it might explode. How could she do this? After everything we'd been through? 7 years of love, memories, and trust, gone in an instant. But then the anger gave way to something worse. Sadness. It hit me like a wave, and I couldn't stop it. I thought about the life we'd built together, the inside jokes, the quiet nights on the couch, the vacations where we'd laugh until our stomachs hurt. Were all of those moments a lie? Did they mean as little to her as they felt to me now? I'll admit it, I cried. I sat there in my car, in the middle of that empty lot, and let the tears come. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the humiliation. The thought that while I was out working, supporting us, and planning our future, she was sneaking around with Blake. The guy was supposed to be one of my closest friends, and the two of them had stabbed me in the back without a second thought. And then there was the self-doubt. Was this my fault? Had I done something wrong? Not given her enough attention? Been too focused on work? My mind kept replaying the past few months, trying to piece together every sign I might have missed, every red flag I'd ignored. By the time I drove back home, it was late, well past midnight. The house was dark, and I could see Sarah's shadow sitting on the couch, waiting for me. I didn't go in right away. I just sat there in the driveway, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I knew one thing for certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent tossing and turning, I decided there was one person I couldn't avoid any longer, Blake. I needed answers, even though part of me already knew the truth. I couldn't just let this go without confronting him. Blake and I had been friends since high school. He was the guy I trusted like a brother. When I got married, he was the one standing beside me as my best man. We'd been through so much together, and the thought of him being the one who betrayed me cut just as deep as Sarah's lies. I didn't call or text him. I wanted to see his face when I asked him outright. So I drove to his office, trying to keep my emotions in check, even though every muscle in my body was tense. When I walked in, he looked surprised but not guilty. Not at first. Eric. Hey, man, what's up? Thought you were out of town, he said casually, leaning back in his chair like everything was normal. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. I didn't waste any time. Cut the crap, Blake. I know. His smile faded instantly, and his whole demeanor shifted. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice tighter now. Don't play dumb with me, I snapped. I know about you and Sarah. The texts, the pictures, the plans to meet up. How long, Blake? How long have you been screwing my wife behind my back? For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his face pale, like he was searching for an escape route. Then, finally, he sighed and rubbed his face. Eric, look, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Never meant for this to happen. I repeated, my voice rising. Are you seriously pulling that line? You never meant for it to happen, but it's been going on for months. Months, Blake. You had every chance to stop, and you didn't. He stood up, holding his hands up defensively. It wasn't like that. It got out of hand. I didn't think it would go this far. You didn't think it would go this far. I was shaking now, barely able to control myself. You didn't think at all, Blake. You didn't think about me, about our friendship, about what this would do to my marriage. You didn't care about anything but yourself. He tried to interrupt, but I wasn't done. Do you know what it felt like to find out that my wife and my best friend, two people I trusted more than anyone, were sneaking around behind my back? You didn't just betray me. You destroyed everything. He sat back down, looking defeated. Eric, I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I screwed up. I know I did. I wanted to punch him, to scream at him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But instead, I just stared at him, shaking my head. You didn't just screw up, Blake. You destroyed 2 lives. And for what? Some fling. Some meaningless affair. I didn't wait for his answer. I turned around and walked out of his office, slamming the door behind me. As I got into my car, the weight of it all hit me again. It wasn't just Sarah who'd betrayed me, it was Blake too. And now, I wasn't sure if I could ever trust anyone again. Driving away from Blake's office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, rage, heartbreak, and something I hadn't expected, clarity. For the first time since discovering the affair, my mind wasn't clouded by confusion or denial. Instead, I was laser-focused. They thought they'd gotten away with it, that their lies would fade into excuses and half-hearted apologies. But no. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. When I got home, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and blotchy from crying. She looked up at me as I walked in, but I didn't stop. I went straight upstairs to our bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing. She followed me up, standing in the doorway, wringing her hands like she didn't know what to do. Eric, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, can we just talk? I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I love you. I zipped the suitcase and looked at her, my expression cold. You love me. You have a funny way of showing it. You didn't think about me when you were sneaking around with Blake. You didn't think about us. So no, Sarah, I don't think there's anything to fix here. Her tears started again, and she stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm. I flinched away. Don't. Don't try to play the victim now. You made your choices. I left the house without looking back, but as I drove away, the idea began to take root in my mind. Sarah and Blake had humiliated me, torn apart my life, and expected to move on as if nothing had happened. If they could so casually destroy everything I'd worked for, why shouldn't I do the same to them? It wasn't immediate. At first, I just toyed with the idea, imagining scenarios where they'd feel the same pain they'd caused me. But the more I thought about it, the more it began to consume me. It wasn't enough for them to feel bad or guilty, they needed to feel the full weight of what they'd done. They needed to lose everything, just like I had. I started planning, bit by bit. I kept my distance from both of them, giving the appearance that I was licking my wounds and moving on. Meanwhile, I was laying the groundwork for something much bigger. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted justice. And justice, in my mind, meant making them regret every single decision that led to this moment. It wasn't about violence or anything drastic. No, that would be too easy, too quick. I wanted to dismantle their lives, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I wanted them to feel the betrayal, the loss, the hopelessness I'd felt when I realized the two people I trusted most in the world had betrayed me. As I sat in my car, staring at the darkened horizon, I made a promise to myself. I would make them pay, not just for what they'd done to me, but for the arrogance of thinking they'd get away with it. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The first step in dismantling their lives was patience. I couldn't let them suspect anything. If they saw me angry or bitter, they might become cautious, and I needed them to stay oblivious. So I played the part of the heartbroken man who was trying to move on. I moved into a small apartment across town and told mutual friends I needed space and time to heal. In reality, I spent every free moment plotting. I combed through every detail of their lives, looking for weak points I could exploit. Sarah had a high-paying job in marketing, where her reputation as a reliable and trustworthy team player was everything. Blake, on the other hand, owned a mid-sized construction business that was doing well enough to support his flashy lifestyle. I knew both of them relied heavily on their images, Sarah as the perfect career woman and Blake as the charming, self-made success story. That gave me an idea. I started with Sarah. Using her work email address and a little creativity, I crafted emails that made it look like she was leaking company information to a competitor. Nothing outright damning, just enough to raise suspicion. I sent them anonymously to her boss and HR, careful to cover my tracks. It didn't take long for the whispers to start at her office. I overheard mutual friends mention that Sarah was under review for some kind of misconduct. She had no idea I was behind it, of course. To her, it was just bad luck piling onto an already stressful time. Blake was next. I knew his business depended on maintaining a squeaky clean reputation, especially since he often bid on city contracts that required strict compliance with regulations. I anonymously tipped off a local journalist about supposed unsafe practices at one of Blake's construction sites. I made sure to include enough details to make it believable. Within a week, there was a news story questioning his company's safety standards. Customers started pulling out of contracts, and Blake had to scramble to manage the fallout. The beauty of it all was that neither of them had any reason to connect the dots back to me. On the surface, I was just the ex-husband who had quietly stepped away from the mess they'd created. Meanwhile, their carefully curated lives were starting to crack. But I wasn't done yet. The final phase of my plan required more finesse. I needed to make it personal, something that would hit them where it hurt the most. Something that would leave a lasting scar. As I sat in my apartment, piecing together the final details, I realized how much I'd changed in such a short time. I wasn't the same Eric who'd walked in on Sarah that night. That version of me was gone, replaced by someone colder, more calculating. But I didn't care. This wasn't about being the bigger person anymore. It was about taking back control of my life, one move at a time. The beauty of revenge is in its slow burn. By the time Sarah and Blake started to feel the full weight of what was happening, it was already too late. I was meticulous, watching from the sidelines as everything I set in motion began to take effect. Sarah was the first to crack. Her job was her pride and joy, a cornerstone of her identity. So when the HR investigation into those emails turned into official disciplinary action, I knew I'd hit the right nerve. Word spread quickly through her office, and her coworkers started treating her differently. That perfect, polished image she worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and she had no clue how to fix it. One evening, I happened to see her by chance, sitting alone at a coffee shop near her office. She looked defeated. Her usual confidence, the spark in her eyes, it was all gone. She was staring blankly at her laptop, likely trying to figure out how to salvage her reputation. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Blake, on the other hand, was unraveling in a completely different way. The hit to his business had been swift and brutal. The news story about unsafe practices had spooked his clients, and I'd made sure to anonymously tip off a few city inspectors to follow up on the claims. The inspections delayed his projects, which meant more lost contracts and angry customers. His once thriving company was now teetering on the edge of collapse. I heard through mutual friends that Blake had started drinking more. He'd always been the life of the party, the guy who could charm anyone in the room, but now that charm was fading. His confident smile was replaced with frustration, and his easygoing demeanor had turned into anger. It didn't take much for people to start questioning whether he was really the success story he pretended to be. As for Sarah and Blake together, the cracks in their relationship were becoming more visible by the day. Without me as their common enemy, they had nothing to hold them together. Sarah's stress over her job and Blake's struggles with his business were putting a strain on whatever fantasy they thought they were living. I imagined their late-night fights, the blame shifting, the guilt. It was poetic, really. But this wasn't just about watching them suffer. I wanted them to know, really know, what it felt like to lose everything. To feel powerless, abandoned, and unsure of what comes next. And I wasn't done yet. The final step in my plan required a bit more finesse, but it would be worth it. I wasn't just going to let their lives spiral out of control. I was going to push them over the edge. By now, Sarah and Blake were shadows of their former selves. Their lives were crumbling in ways they couldn't control, and I could see the desperation setting in. But I wasn't finished. I wanted the final blow to be something they couldn't recover from, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I decided to use the one thing they thought they had successfully hidden, the affair itself. Up until this point, they had been lucky. Only I knew about their betrayal, and they had kept their secret from the rest of the world. But secrets like that don't stay buried forever. I started with Blake. I drafted an anonymous letter and sent it to his remaining business partners and key clients. The letter included screenshots of text messages between him and Sarah, carefully curated to make it clear that their relationship had started long before my marriage ended. I even added a note suggesting that his poor judgment in his personal life might reflect his business ethics. It worked. The fallout was immediate. Blake called me a few days later, his voice panicked. It was the first time we had spoken since I confronted him at his office. "Eric, what the hell is this?" he demanded. "Did you send something to my clients? They're pulling out of deals, man. I'm losing everything. I played dumb." "I have no idea what you're talking about, Blake. Maybe this is karma catching up to you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he muttered, "You son of a," and hung up. It was satisfying, hearing him crack like that, but I wasn't done yet. Sarah's turn came next. Her office had been suspicious of her ever since the anonymous emails, but they hadn't fired her, yet. I decided to nudge things along. I created a new email account and sent her boss a message claiming to be a concerned spouse who had recently discovered the affair. I attached the same screenshots I had sent to Blake's clients, making it clear that Sarah's personal conduct might be compromising her professional reputation. Within days, Sarah was called into another meeting with HR. This time, the rumors about her were no longer whispers, they were full-blown accusations. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was placed on unpaid leave while the company conducted a formal investigation. She'd always been so proud of her career, but now it was slipping through her fingers. The best part? They still had no idea it was me pulling the strings. They were too busy trying to save themselves to think about who might be orchestrating their downfall. With the walls closing in on them, I could almost taste my victory. But there was one final move to make, a confrontation that would bring everything to a head. I wanted to see the looks on their faces when they realized I'd outsmarted them at every turn. I waited until the perfect moment to strike. Sarah and Blake were already cornered, their lives unraveling piece by piece. They were desperate, grasping at straws to salvage their reputations, their livelihoods, and probably their relationship. But the worst part for them? They still didn't know who was behind their downfall. That's what made the confrontation so satisfying. I texted both of them from an anonymous number. It was simple and direct: we need to talk. Tonight. Both of you. Meet me at Blake's office. 8 p.m. I knew they'd come. They were too paranoid, too desperate to figure out what was happening to ignore a cryptic message like that. And sure enough, when I arrived at Blake's office that evening, they were both there, sitting across from each other in tense silence. The second I walked in, the tension in the room shifted. "Eric?" Sarah's voice cracked when she saw me. Blake's face went pale. "What's going on? Why are you?" I cut her off. "Sit down. Both of you." They obeyed, though I could see Blake bristling. He wasn't used to being told what to do, but he must have sensed that now wasn't the time to push me. I sat across from them, my calm demeanor a stark contrast to the panic etched across their faces. "You've been wondering why everything in your lives is falling apart," I started, my voice cold and deliberate. "Why your reputations are in shreds. Why your jobs, your businesses, your perfect little lives are crumbling. Well, let me make it simple for you: it was me." Their reactions were priceless. Sarah's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. Blake leaned forward, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "You? What the hell are you talking about?" I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my words settle. "Did you really think you could betray me and get away with it? That I'd just move on while you two went on with your lives like nothing happened?" I looked directly at Sarah. "You lied to my face. You destroyed our marriage. And you," I said, turning to Blake, "you betrayed a friendship that spanned over a decade. You both thought you were so clever, so untouchable. But I've been watching. Planning. And now, everything you built is gone." Sarah started crying, muttering apologies, but I didn't care. I wasn't here for her excuses. Blake, on the other hand, was fuming. "You're insane," he spat. "You think this makes you the better man? Ruining our lives doesn't fix anything." "Fix anything?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You don't get it, do you? This was never about fixing anything. This was about making sure you both felt what I felt: betrayed, humiliated, broken. And now you do." Blake slammed his fist on the table, but I didn't flinch. "You've gone too far, Eric. You think this is over? We'll rebuild, and you'll..." "Rebuild?" I interrupted, my voice icy. "Blake, you've lost your business. Sarah, your career is hanging by a thread. You'll be lucky if you can show your faces in public without people whispering about what you've done. Rebuild all you want, but the stain of what you did will follow you forever." The room was silent, save for Sarah's quiet sobs. I stood up, looking down at the two of them, two people who had once been the closest to me but were now nothing more than strangers. "I didn't just want revenge," I said, my voice steady. "I wanted you both to know that trust isn't something you can shatter without consequences. Enjoy what's left of your lives. You earned it." With that, I walked out, leaving them behind to pick up the pieces of the wreckage they had created, and I had finished. Walking out of Blake's office that night, I felt hollow. I'd envisioned this moment for months, imagining how satisfying it would be to see them crumble under the weight of their betrayal and my carefully crafted revenge. And to some extent, it was satisfying. Their shock, their panic, the realization that they couldn't undo what I'd done, it was everything I'd hoped for. But as I drove home, the adrenaline started to wear off, and something else crept in. What now? For months, my life had revolved around planning their downfall. Every spare moment was consumed by thoughts of payback, every decision made with one goal in mind. But now that it was over, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The rage that had fueled me was gone, leaving an emptiness I didn't know how to fill. At first, I told myself it was normal. Revenge is messy, and closure doesn't always come in neat packages. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this whole ordeal had changed me in ways I wasn't sure I liked. I wasn't the person I used to be, the trusting, easygoing guy who believed in the best in people. That version of me had died the moment I opened Sarah's phone and saw the truth. Still, there were moments when I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Sarah had been fired from her job, an inevitable conclusion after the HR investigation revealed ethical concerns. She was working part-time at some local boutique, a far cry from the high-powered career she once boasted about. Blake, on the other hand, had officially declared bankruptcy. His construction business was gone, his house foreclosed on, and his reputation in shambles. Mutual friends told me he'd moved into a dingy apartment on the other side of town and was keeping a low profile. They weren't together anymore. That, in some twisted way, felt like the ultimate proof that they had never really loved each other. Their relationship had been built on lies and betrayal, and once the pressure mounted, it had collapsed like a house of cards. Part of me was glad, they didn't deserve happiness. Not after what they'd done. But even as I told myself I'd won, there was a nagging thought in the back of my mind, was it worth it? I'd spent so much energy on them, so much time plotting and executing my revenge, that I'd put my own life on hold. My friendships had suffered. My career had stagnated. And while I'd inflicted damage on Sarah and Blake, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd also hurt myself in the process. One night, sitting alone in my apartment with a drink in hand, I found myself thinking about the Eric I used to be. The guy who believed in love, in loyalty, in second chances. That version of me felt like a stranger now, someone I could barely remember. I wasn't sure if I'd ever get him back, or if I even wanted to. Revenge had given me a sense of control, a way to reclaim power when I felt powerless. But it hadn't healed the wounds they'd left behind. Those wounds were mine to deal with, long after they were gone. In the weeks after the confrontation, I started to feel the weight of everything I'd done. The revenge was complete, but the silence that followed was deafening. There were no more plans to make, no more schemes to execute. It was just me, sitting in my small apartment, trying to figure out what the hell came next. The truth was, I'd been so consumed by anger and pain that I hadn't thought about my own future. My career had taken a back seat while I focused on dismantling Sarah and Blake's lives. My friends, the ones who'd stayed neutral or distant during the fallout, didn't really know how to approach me anymore. I wasn't the same person they remembered. Hell, I wasn't even sure I knew who I was anymore. One night, after too many drinks and too much time staring at my ceiling, I decided I couldn't stay in this limbo any longer. I needed to start rebuilding, to find something, anything, that would help me move forward. So, I made a list. It was simple at first. 1. Get back to work. 2. Reconnect with friends. 3. Focus on myself. It felt cliché, but I didn't care. I needed structure, a way to climb out of the hole I'd dug myself into. The next morning, I called my boss and asked to take on more projects. I told him I'd been going through a rough patch but was ready to get back on track. To my surprise, he was understanding. Take it one step at a time, he said. We've missed having you fully in the game. Work became my escape. It gave me something to focus on, something that didn't involve Sarah or Blake. Slowly but surely, I started to feel competent again, like I could still accomplish something meaningful. Reconnecting with friends was harder. Some of them had distanced themselves during the fallout, uncomfortable with the drama surrounding my divorce and the rumors about Sarah and Blake. Others had stayed, but I'd pushed them away, too caught up in my revenge to let anyone in. I reached out to a few of them, apologizing for disappearing and explaining, in vague terms, that I was trying to move forward. Some responded warmly, others cautiously. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The hardest part, though, was focusing on myself. For so long, my identity had been tied to my marriage, to my role as a husband, and then to my anger and need for revenge. Without those things, I felt adrift. Who was I now? What did I even want out of life? Therapy became part of the answer. I'd always thought I didn't need it, that I could handle things on my own. But sitting in that therapist's office, talking through everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the emptiness, I realized just how much I'd been carrying. My therapist didn't judge me for what I'd done. Instead, she helped me unpack the emotions behind it and figure out how to let go of the anger that was still clinging to me. It wasn't easy. Some days, it felt like I wasn't making any progress at all. But other days, I'd catch glimpses of the person I used to be, someone who could laugh, who could hope, who could imagine a future that didn't revolve around pain. Rebuilding wasn't a straight line, but I was trying. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. A few months into rebuilding my life, something happened that I didn't see coming. I got a message from Sarah. It came through email, short, direct, and utterly unexpected. "Eric, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." My first instinct was to ignore it. What could she possibly have to say that I'd want to hear? She was the last person I wanted back in my life, even for a moment. But the more I stared at the email, the more curious I became. What did she want? And why now? After a day of going back and forth in my head, I decided to respond. My reply was curt: "What do you want?" I wasn't interested in pleasantries or giving her the impression that I cared about whatever was going on in her life. Her response came quickly, almost as if she'd been waiting by her phone. "I just want to meet and explain some things. I owe you that much. Please, just one conversation." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told her we'd meet in public, somewhere neutral, and I made it clear that this wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. I just wanted to hear whatever excuse she had cooked up and finally close the door on this chapter of my life. We met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. When I walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked tired, older, almost. The confident, put-together woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who seemed weighed down by guilt and regret. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. Her voice was soft, tentative, like she wasn't sure how to begin. "Get to the point, Sarah," I said, keeping my tone cold. I didn't want her to think I was there to console her. She hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her coffee cup. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the affair, for lying to you, for the way I handled, all of it." I didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. Apologies were easy. I wasn't interested in empty words. "But there's more," she added, her voice trembling now. "Blake, he's been threatening me." That caught me off guard. "Threatening you? What do you mean?" She glanced around nervously, as if someone might be listening. "After everything fell apart, after you," she paused, swallowing hard. "After you exposed us, Blake blamed me for everything. He said it was my fault his business failed, that I ruined his life. At first, it was just angry texts and phone calls, but lately," her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. "Lately, he's been showing up at my apartment, saying I owe him, that I have to pay him back for what he lost." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as more drama she'd brought on herself, but another part of me knew Blake well enough to believe it. He was the type to lash out when things didn't go his way. "So, what do you want from me, Sarah?" I asked, my tone sharp. "You think I'm going to swoop in and save you from him? After everything you did?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she held my gaze. "No. I don't know who else to turn to. I know I don't deserve your help, Eric, but I'm scared. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Helping her wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, not after everything she'd done to me. But as I looked at her, broken and desperate, I realized this wasn't about her. This was about Blake, and if he was as unhinged as she claimed, this might not be over yet, for either of us. Sarah's words lingered long after I left the coffee shop. I hadn't agreed to help her, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to, but the idea of Blake spiraling out of control gnawed at me. This wasn't just her problem. If Blake was desperate enough to threaten her, what was stopping him from coming after me next? I had been the one to orchestrate his downfall, after all. The next few days were a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing, something I hadn't accounted for. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, double-checking locks, glancing over my shoulder when I left my apartment. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe I'd finally poked the wrong bear. Then, late one night, I got a call. It was Sarah. "Eric, he's outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's banging on my door. I don't know what to do." My first instinct was to tell her to call the police, but something about her tone stopped me. She sounded terrified, and for all the bitterness I still harbored toward her, I didn't want to be the kind of person who turned a blind eye to someone in danger, even her. "Stay on the phone," I said, already grabbing my keys. "I'm on my way." The drive to her apartment was tense. My mind raced with possibilities, what Blake might do, how far he might go. By the time I pulled up outside her building, my hands were clenched tightly around the steering wheel. I spotted Blake immediately. He was pacing in front of Sarah's door, his movements erratic, his voice loud enough to carry through the quiet street. "You think you can just ruin my life and get away with it?" he shouted, his fists pounding against the door. "You owe me, Sarah. Open the damn door." I stepped out of my car, keeping my distance but making my presence known. "Blake." I called out, my voice firm. "That's enough." He turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw the man I used to call my best friend. But his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and filled with a rage I hadn't seen before. "You," he growled, taking a step toward me. "This is your fault. You think you're so smart, don't you? Sitting in the shadows, pulling strings like some kind of puppet master." I didn't flinch. "Go home, Blake. You're drunk, and you're making this worse for yourself." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Home? What home? You took everything from me, Eric. My business, my reputation, everything I worked for, gone because of you." "You did that to yourself," I shot back. "You made your choices, Blake. You don't get to blame me for the consequences." His face twisted with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. Instead, he pointed a finger in my direction. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With that, he turned and stalked off into the night, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. I waited until he was out of sight before knocking on Sarah's door. She opened it cautiously, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I just nodded and left. On the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying Blake's words in my head, "This isn't over." He was unhinged, desperate, and unpredictable, a dangerous combination. And I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. Blake's words haunted me for days. "This isn't over." I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, drunk and furious, like a man who had nothing left to lose. It wasn't just a threat, it felt like a promise. I had pushed him to the edge, but now it seemed like he was ready to push back. I started noticing things. Subtle at first. A car idling outside my apartment late at night, its engine humming in the darkness. Anonymous calls to my phone that would disconnect as soon as I answered. Small things that could have been coincidences, but felt too deliberate to ignore. Then, one evening, as I was heading out for groceries, I found a note slipped under my door. It was scrawled in messy handwriting, but the message was crystal clear: "I haven't forgotten what you did. Watch your back." I stared at the note for what felt like hours, a cold knot forming in my stomach. This was no longer just about Sarah. Blake was coming for me, and he wasn't playing games anymore. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to take control before things spiraled even further. The next day, I went to the police. I told them about Blake showing up at Sarah's apartment, about the threats he'd made, and about the note I'd found. The officer at the desk listened patiently, nodding as I explained the situation. "Do you have any evidence that ties him directly to these threats?" she asked. I hesitated. The note was anonymous, and the calls could have been from anyone. I told her about the confrontation at Sarah's apartment, but without physical evidence, there wasn't much they could do. "File a restraining order," she suggested. "And document everything. If he tries anything else, we'll have a stronger case." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was better than nothing. I filed the paperwork for the restraining order and left the station feeling slightly more in control, but the unease lingered. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. "You think a piece of paper will stop me? You started this, Eric. You can't hide behind the law." My hands clenched around the phone. Blake was right about one thing: I had started this. I'd torn his life apart, dismantling everything he'd built, and now he was coming for me with the same relentless drive I'd used against him. But there was one key difference: I wasn't the same person I'd been when this all started. I wasn't scared. I wasn't powerless. If Blake wanted a fight, I was ready. I spent the next few days preparing, going through every possible scenario. I installed security cameras around my apartment and started carrying pepper spray wherever I went. I let a few close friends know what was happening, just in case Blake tried to drag anyone else into his mess. Most importantly, I made sure Sarah was safe. As much as I hated being pulled back into her orbit, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was just as much a target as I was. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The calls stopped. The texts stopped. No cars lingered outside my apartment, and no more notes appeared under my door. It felt like the calm before the storm, and I knew better than to let my guard down. Blake was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when he did, I'd be ready. The quiet didn't last long. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard it. A sharp, metallic clatter outside my apartment window, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. My heart rate spiked as I glanced at the live feed from the security cameras I'd installed. Sure enough, there he was, Blake, lurking in the shadows near the back entrance. I grabbed the pepper spray from the counter and called the police, keeping my voice low. "There's a man outside my apartment. His name is Blake. He's been threatening me. I think he's trying to break in." The dispatcher assured me that officers were on the way, but I couldn't just wait. I wasn't the same person Blake had once manipulated and betrayed. I wasn't going to hide in fear while he tried to intimidate me. If he wanted a fight, he'd get one. I moved to the door quietly, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the peephole. Blake wasn't there. He must have gone around the side. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw a text from an unknown number. "Come out, Eric. Let's settle this." I stepped back, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I wasn't about to let him call the shots. But just as I was deciding whether to wait for the police or confront him myself, I heard the unmistakable sound of a lock being jimmied. He was trying to get in. That was it. I wasn't going to let him come into my home, into my sanctuary. I swung the door open, startling him as he stood hunched over the lock. His eyes widened for a split second before narrowing with fury. "You've got some nerve," I said, keeping my voice steady even though adrenaline was pumping through me. "You ruined my life, Eric," he growled, stepping closer. His face was a mix of anger and desperation, his hands twitching as if he didn't know whether to lash out or back down. "You think you can just destroy everything I had and walk away? You destroyed your own life," I snapped back. "You lied, you cheated, and now you're acting like I'm the villain for making you face the consequences." He lunged at me, and instinct took over. I raised the pepper spray and let it loose, hitting him square in the face. He staggered back, cursing and clawing at his eyes, but I didn't let up. I shouted for him to get on the ground, my voice shaking but firm. Just then, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the street outside. The sound of sirens grew louder as the police arrived, and within seconds, 2 officers were pulling Blake to the ground. He screamed about how this wasn't over, how I'd pay for what I'd done, but his words felt hollow now. He was finished. As the officers cuffed him and led him to a squad car, one of them turned to me. "Are you okay, sir?" I nodded, still gripping the pepper spray. "Yeah. I'm fine." But the truth was, I didn't feel fine. I felt exhausted, like the weight of everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the fear, was finally crashing down on me. Watching Blake get driven away should have felt like a victory, but all I felt was relief that it was over. The next morning, I got a call from the police. Blake had been charged with attempted breaking and entering, harassment, and violating the restraining order. It was enough to ensure he'd be out of my life for a long time. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The chapter with Sarah and Blake was finally closed. I didn't feel triumph or even satisfaction, just a quiet sense of peace that I hadn't known I needed. Life wasn't perfect after that. There were still scars, still moments when I questioned if I'd handled things the right way. But I was finally free, free to rebuild, free to let go, free to find myself again. And that, more than anything, felt like a victory.